Thus far in the unit, we focused in on what factors influence the climate of today, but our culminating experience will have students imagining what their cities will be like with the climate of the future that has more weather extremes. They'll demonstrate everything that they've learned in this lesson sequence, the unit's culminating experience. Check out the PDF Culminating Experience Teacher Guide in Lesson 3.27. It's an online-only exclusive. It's not in the printed teacher guide. And we'll walk you through some of the key pieces here. It's got thought starters if students are struggling with great ideas for their climate fiction story. Example student work, in this case, it's the graphs, analysis, and climate fiction story that your students are going to be producing. And our detailed rubric with categories for each of the NGSS dimensions. Let's focus in on one element of the rubric that asks us to show a cause and effect relationship. Basically, we want students to identify part of climate change that is a cause and a potential hazard that's the effect. For example, warmer temperatures cause more coastal flooding. Now that's sufficient for our basic students, but we can ask our more advanced students to go one step further. How exactly do warmer temperatures cause more coastal flooding? What are some of the intermediate events in that chain of cause and effect? Like land ice melts in the Arctic. So keep pushing your students to integrate these scientific relationships in their story. But that's not all. We don't want a dry informational text just about the science. We want them to convey the science through a story so that it shows how this hazard creates conflict for the characters. How do they feel as a result of these changes? Creating this empathy is not only important for empowering students to become environmental leaders, but research shows that it also helps solidify the learning of the science. Let's see how we build up this story lesson by lesson, starting off with some lessons to focus in on climate change. In Lesson 3.24, we warm up by reviewing the factors that affect climate, like pressure, latitude, altitude, mountains, and oceans. Then students participate in the climate game, where they get climate data for 7 mystery cities, along with a map and 7 city names. They have to figure out which data belongs to each city on the map. The class then shares the results as we find out whether their selections were correct. In Lesson 3.25, students begin by remembering the unit challenge to create a story for friends or family who live in another city or town, warning them about possible future weather and climate extremes. Students view some videos as an introduction to predictions about how climate change is going to affect cities. And then we dig deep into one example, the floods following wildfires presentation. In addition to seeing the cascading effects of climate change, we meet Dr. Warren Washington, a distinguished atmospheric scientist who led important research into climate and climate change. Then, students use some reliable websites to gather information about the projections for future climate change in different regions. They create a class list of all the potential changes that they discovered and predict which of their adopted cities might be affected by each change. Finally, students participate in the unit concept checkpoint number 2, which is a formative assessment with challenging questions that both assess and solidify their knowledge. So be sure to ask students about why the incorrect answers are wrong, because that is going to help them address some common misconceptions. In Lesson 3.26, it's time to start the culminating experience. The CLI-FI project presentation makes sure that your students know what is CLI-FI. And then we read and discuss an example CLI-FI story, Simon Travels. What makes it interesting, and what makes the story fit into the CLI-FI style? Next, students start to develop their story by using the story activity worksheet. It's got a brainstorming activity and tips for creating a powerful story. And then hand out the rubric near the end of class and briefly describe it, though we're actually going to be going through it in more detail tomorrow. That's how we begin Lesson 3.27 with a discussion of the project rubric, item by item. But the rest of the day is a work day, so make sure your students can fill in the simple climate change cause and effect diagram that their stories are going to address and push them to add more boxes to the chain of cause and effect. Now, the culminating experience requires more than just the CLI-FI stories. Students need to include some scientific information about the climate in their city, and we'll focus on describing that in Lesson 3.28. The CLI-FI project instructions handout describes some of the expectations. First, they're going to graph the weather data that they collected for their adopted city, and then they're going to write an analysis of what that graph shows. They'll describe the range of weather phenomena both that they observed and that happened in the city during the rest of the year when they weren't able to make observations. They'll talk about how different climate factors affect that range of phenomena. They'll also graph average climate data, including monthly temperature and precipitation that they download from internet sources. What evidence can they see of the factors that affect climate in these data? finally, they should include some predictions about how climate change will affect that city in the future. Lesson 3.29 is a work day. Start by checking in with where students are and have them make a list of everything they still need to complete for the project. Students that finish early can swap stories and provide feedback to each other, and students that don't finish can wrap things up at home. In Lesson 3.30, it's time to share stories. But remember, storytelling is a very personal expression, so we start by acknowledging that as a class and committing to being respectful and supportive. We spend the day sharing stories. And then tomorrow, we're going to be taking our final assessment and reflect on these stories. So for homework, students can review their work so far, or they can complete the end of unit study guide. Now you can find that by clicking on the resources tab in the Unit 3 overview page on the Green Ninja Curriculum website. In Lesson 3.31, students begin by taking the unit assessment. And then once students have completed that assessment, we participate in a unit reflection, including further sharing and discussing of the stories, what we've learned, what we found hard to understand, and what we liked best about the unit. That's it for Unit 3. In Unit 4, we take a deep dive into the effects of climate change on plants and animals.